I endured 13 years of control and affairs, but the tracking app he installed revealed something darker. At 47, I gave my husband Robert one final warning. Stay away from Vincent's place. I told him that Tuesday morning, my voice steady as stone, my eyes holding his with the kind of certainty that comes from knowing exactly what's about to unfold. He just smiled, that same contemptuous smirk he'd been wearing for 13 years, the expression of a man who believed the world bent to his will simply because he demanded it. "You think I'm afraid of your little boyfriend, Michelle?" he said, his words dripping with that quiet, seething fury that always preceded destruction. He didn't throw anything. He didn't shout. He simply grabbed his wallet and keys and walked out the door like he was heading to pick up groceries. 6 hours later, my phone shattered the silence. A male voice, official and heavy with the weight of bad news. "Mrs. Patterson, this is Officer Chen. You need to come to Mercy General Hospital immediately. There's been a serious incident involving your husband." I remember standing there in our kitchen in suburban Portland, fingers going numb around the phone, a strange calm washing over me as I wondered which one of them was lying in a hospital bed and which one was about to face the consequences that had been building for over a decade. Robert and I had been married for 13 years. 13 years of slow suffocation wrapped in the illusion of suburban contentment. In the beginning, he was magnetic, driven, the kind of man who could walk into a room and make everyone believe he was the most important person there. He managed a regional sales team for a pharmaceutical company, pulling in around $75,000 a year, enough to buy us a decent 3-bedroom house with a yard, enough to make our neighbors think we had it all figured out. But what they couldn't see from their manicured lawns was the decay happening inside those walls. The kind that doesn't announce itself with crashes and screams, but settles in like mold, quiet and poisonous. He had his affairs. I'm not naive enough to have missed them. The late-night texts he'd hide, the smell of unfamiliar perfume clinging to his collar, the way his eyes would go distant when I tried to talk about anything real. I had my patience, or what I convinced myself was patience. Really, it was just the numbness that comes from giving up. Until I met Vincent. Vincent was everything Robert had forgotten how to be. Gentle, present, the kind of man who looked at you and actually saw a human being, not a possession to be maintained. He was a physical therapist at the clinic where I ended up after a car accident 18 months ago. One session became three became excuses to stay longer, and soon he became more than an escape. He became the oxygen I didn't know I'd been suffocating without. Robert wasn't stupid, just dangerously arrogant. He noticed the shift in me, the way I started smiling at my phone, the way I'd find reasons to leave the house, the way I stopped flinching when he raised his voice. One night, after I'd come home from what I told him was a yoga class, he cornered me in our bedroom. "If I ever find out who he is, Michelle," he said, his voice low and controlled, each word deliberate, "I will make absolutely certain he regrets every single moment he ever touched what belongs to me." That was the moment I understood with perfect clarity that Robert had never loved me. He owned me, like he owned his car, his golf clubs, his spot at the bar on Friday nights. What I discovered next should have terrified me, but instead it crystallized something cold and purposeful in my chest. He'd been following me for months. I found the tracking app on my phone hidden in the settings. I discovered he'd been reading my emails, going through my messages while I slept. He'd even hired some cut-rate private investigator who'd been tailing me for 6 weeks, documenting every coffee I had with Vincent, every moment of happiness Robert couldn't control. When I found the investigator's report stuffed in a folder in his home office, detailed timestamps and grainy photographs of me and Vincent laughing outside a cafe, I didn't panic. I didn't cry. Something shifted inside me, and for the first time in 13 years, I smiled with real intention. I started planning with the kind of precision I'd only ever applied to managing our household, to keeping Robert's life comfortable while my own withered. First, I called our insurance agent, a friendly woman named Patricia who I'd met at a neighborhood barbecue. Made small talk about coverage, mentioned I'd been worrying about accidents lately, about what would happen if something terrible occurred. Robert's life insurance policy was substantial, $280,000, a payout that suddenly looked less like protection and more like possibility. Next, I ordered a small recording device online, the kind that private investigators actually use. and carefully installed it under the driver's seat of Robert's Honda Accord. I needed documentation. I needed his words, his threats, his intentions captured in his own voice, insurance of a different kind. Then I did something that still haunts me in the quiet hours before dawn. I warned Vincent. Don't engage with him, I said over coffee at our usual spot, watching his kind face crease with concern. Don't try to talk to him. Don't try to reason with him. Please, Vincent, just stay away. But Vincent believed in dignity, in handling conflicts like adults, in the possibility that two reasonable people could find common ground. That belief, that fundamental decency, was what nearly destroyed him. The call came on a Thursday. 6 hours after Robert had walked out with that determined look in his eyes. 6 hours I'd spent in a strange state between dread and anticipation, like watching storm clouds gather and knowing the lightning was inevitable. When I arrived at Mercy General, the antiseptic smell hit me with physical force, sharp and clinical and wrong. A nurse with exhausted eyes led me through corridors that seemed to narrow with each step, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like trapped insects. Your husband is in police custody, she said quietly, her voice careful, practiced in delivering terrible news. Your friend is stable, but his injuries are severe. Friend. The word felt like a slap. I pushed through the heavy door into the ICU room, and the sight that greeted me was something I'd prepared for but somehow still wasn't ready to see. Vincent lay motionless on the hospital bed, his face a canvas of purple and black, so swollen I barely recognized the man who'd made me laugh just 2 days ago. Tubes snaked from his arms, machines beat their mechanical rhythm, and his chest rose and fell with assistance. In the corner of the room, incongruous and surreal, Robert sat in a wheelchair, his right hand cuffed to the armrest, his shirt splattered with blood that wasn't his own. When our eyes met, he smiled. Actually smiled, that same arrogant expression, even diminished by circumstances. You should have told me he was such a coward, Michelle, he said, his voice carrying that casual cruelty I'd lived with for 13 years. Barely put up a fight. I didn't ask what happened. The scene told the story with brutal clarity. The nurse's averted eyes filled in the details Robert's smile couldn't hide. Vincent would survive, but barely, and he'd carry the scars forever. Robert, on the other hand, would face charges that would strip away everything he'd built his identity on. Control, power, freedom. But what no one in that hospital room understood, what Robert in his supreme arrogance couldn't possibly grasp, was that this was exactly what I'd been waiting for. Not hoping for, but waiting for with the patience of someone who understood that men like Robert always, inevitably, destroyed themselves. While Robert sat in his holding cell awaiting arraignment, convinced he'd acted to defend his marriage, to reclaim what was rightfully his, I moved with swift and absolute purpose. I contacted the insurance company, my voice appropriately shaken, explaining that as his spouse, I needed to understand our financial position given the catastrophic legal situation. I shifted assets from joint accounts into my name only, small enough amounts to avoid immediate flags, but steady enough to hollow out what we built. I liquidated the investment account Robert didn't think I knew about, the one he'd been hiding for his planned retirement, probably his exit strategy when he eventually tired of me completely. But my real masterstroke was the recording. Hours of Robert's voice, captured over weeks in his car, talking to himself, talking on his phone to his drinking buddies, his words painting a portrait of escalating obsession and violent intent. If I catch that bastard, I'll make sure he never walks again, he'd said just 3 days before the attack, his voice cold and deliberate. I'll put him in the ground if I have to. I sent that recording to his public defender, framed as evidence I'd found that troubled me, that I felt ethically obligated to share. The prosecutor's office called me within 36 hours. They wanted to use it to establish premeditation, to upgrade the charges from assault to attempted murder. By the time Robert realized what was happening, that the narrative being constructed wasn't of a wronged husband defending his honor, but of a violent predator who'd carefully planned an attack, it was too late. His empire of ego, built on intimidation and control, crumbled with spectacular speed. The man who'd owned me, who'd believed he owned everything he touched, found himself at the mercy of systems he couldn't manipulate, bound by consequences he couldn't charm his way out of. But I wasn't finished. A month before his sentencing hearing, I visited him in county jail. The visiting room smelled of industrial cleaner, and desperation separated us with plexiglass that made his face look distant and small. He'd lost maybe 30 pounds, his skin had taken on that gray pallor that comes from fluorescent light and no hope, and his eyes held something I'd never seen before: recognition. "You orchestrated this," he said, not a question but a statement of fact. "You manipulated me into destroying myself." I tilted my head, keeping my expression neutral, the same mask I'd worn for 13 years. "I didn't have to manipulate anything, Robert. I just stopped preventing you from being who you've always been." He laughed then, that same arrogant sound, though hollow now, echoing wrong in the small room. "And your precious Vincent? How's he doing with the guilt of what happened to him because of you?" That was the only question that landed. "He's recovering," I said quietly. "Slowly. He'll carry the scars forever." Robert leaned as close to the glass as his chains allowed, and for just a moment, I saw past the arrogance to something sharper underneath. "You knew. You warned him, but you knew I'd go after him anyway. You wanted me to. You needed me to do something unforgivable so you could take everything." The silence that followed was heavy with truth neither of us wanted to fully acknowledge. Because he wasn't entirely wrong. I had known. I'd warned Vincent, yes, but some part of me, some dark, calculating part I didn't want to examine too closely, had understood that the only way to truly free myself from Robert was to let him destroy himself so completely, so publicly, that there would be no coming back from it. Vincent never fully recovered. Not just physically, though the injuries left him with chronic pain and a limp he'd carry forever, but something in him broke that day, some fundamental belief in the safety of the world, in the possibility of love without destruction. He moved away 8 months after the attack, sent me a brief email saying he needed to start over somewhere I wasn't, somewhere that didn't taste like blood and regret every time he opened his eyes. I didn't try to stop him. I didn't chase him with explanations or apologies. Because what could I say? That I loved him but loved my freedom more? That I'd calculated the risks and decided his pain was an acceptable cost for my liberation? Robert was sentenced to 9 years. Attempted murder, aggravated assault, violation of a restraining order Vincent had filed after the first threatening phone call, which I'd encouraged him to document. He'll be eligible for parole in 6, maybe less with good behavior, though I doubt good behavior comes naturally to men like Robert. By the time he walks free, if he ever does, I'll be someone else entirely, somewhere he'll never find me, living a life built on the ashes of everything we were. Sometimes, late at night when sleep won't come and the house settles into its creaking silence, I replay the events like a film I've watched too many times. Frame by frame. Breath by breath. Robert's face in that courtroom when they read the verdict, the way his shoulders fell as if someone had cut his strings. Vincent's stillness in that hospital bed, machines breathing for him, his beautiful hands bandaged and broken. My own reflection in the plexiglass during that final visit. Expression carefully controlled, eyes revealing nothing. People ask me sometimes, acquaintances who know parts of the story but not the whole terrible architecture of it, if I regret any of it. If I wish I'd made different choices, taken different paths. The answer is no. Regret is for people who lose control, who get swept up in currents they didn't see coming. I never lost control. I simply redirected it, like electricity through copper wire, guided it with precision until it burned exactly where I wanted it to burn. Robert thought he could own me, possess me like one of his quarterly sales targets. Vincent thought he could save me, that love alone could be enough to overcome the darkness I carried. Neither of them understood that I was never the damsel trapped in the tower. I was the architect who built it. I was the fuse buried in the foundation. And when the spark finally came, when everything ignited exactly as I'd known it would, I didn't flinch. I didn't close my eyes. I just watched the fire do what fire does best. Robert believed he destroyed Vincent to punish me, to reclaim his property, to prove that his will could not be defied. But all he really did was hand me the perfect ending. He gave me freedom wrapped in his own destruction, wealth purchased with his incarceration, and a future he could never touch again. And if that makes me the villain in someone else's story, if that makes me the kind of woman people whisper about with equal parts fascination and horror, I can live with that. I've lived with worse. I spent 13 years as Robert's wife, wearing his last name like chains, and I survived. This is just the epilogue. The part where the woman everyone underestimated walks away from the wreckage, brushes the ash from her shoulders, and finally breathes.